sallallahu alaihi wasallam invented? No. If we open any Bible in Arabic, we will find God is called Allah. We find if we read the Hebrew, if we read the Aramaic, God is called Allah. It's the Aramaic, or Allah actually, Allah. So they clung to the worship of only God. For all of this time. Of course, some people amongst them went astray and some of them were misguided. And then God would send them another prophet and another prophet. And in fact, with every generation of them, God always had a messenger to remind them and to teach them and to expound the truth to them. So they were favored in that regard. Now, I want us to think very carefully about the many different and diverse religions and beliefs that existed in the time of Jesus. And what we begin to understand is something quite remarkable. If we examine the mythologies that were prevalent at the time, of the various gods and the various pantheon of gods that people in the world worshipped at that time, we had the likes of Apollo, of Hercules, of Dionysus, who were worshipped by the Greeks and the Romans. Of course, Mithra was a god that was worshipped by the Persians. Adonis and Artis were worshipped by the Babylonians. Osiris, Isis and Horus by the Egyptians. Baal, Astarte and Tammuz again by the Mesopotamians. And all of these gods had a very similar story. And this is now where it becomes quite fascinating. All of these gods, if we examine the mythology, the story and the history of these gods, they all shared an almost identical and similar story. First of all, they were all called mediator, savior, healer, light bearer, deliverer. These were the common names of these gods. And their story almost always is orientated around their birth taking place on or around the 25th of September, of a virgin in a cave. These are all human beings who are gods. So they are man gods. And often they are the son of a god. And often we find, as in the case of Mithra, for example, they are part of a trinity of gods. In the case of Mithra, we have Mithra, Sol Invictus, and Saturnalius. This is a trinity of gods the Romans, in fact, invented. And it becomes very important, this particular trinity and this particular belief the Romans had will become very important, and we will understand it, God willing, in a minute. So all of these gods were born on or around the 25th of December. At that time, they were defeated or nearly overcome by darkness and the god of the underworld, and they were taken into the underworld. But they were reborn again. They were reborn again. And their rebirth always took place on or around Easter time. Their rebirth took place on or around Easter time. In fact, the word Easter itself comes from the name of the goddess of light, Eostra, or Astarte, or Ishtar. Ishtar, Astarte, Eostre. They are the names of goddesses, and the word Easter is actually derived from them. Sunday is named after the sun god. Tuesday, Thursday, Thor, after Thor. In fact, all of the days of the week that we know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, they are named Saturday after Saturnalius. They are named after Roman gods. Sunday was the holy day of most pagans, because all of these gods that we're talking about were derived from nature worship. And their story was all the same because the experience of human beings was very similar throughout the world. They found that on or around, and I say the world, the Western Hemisphere, of course, down in Australia it works all quite differently, okay? But we're talking about the Western world here. We find why. Why is their story so similar? Why is their story so much the same? Because this is what paganism is. Paganism is the worship of nature. And so what happened on or around the 25th of December? Around the 25th of December, what do we have? The winter solstice. The winter solstice is the shortest day. And for pagans who worship the sun was one of the things they worshipped and reverenced the most. So at the time of the winter solstice, they imagined that the sun was dying. That the sun was dying. In the northern hemisphere, especially up in the north, that is why, for example, they would cut down an evergreen tree. They would cut down a tree, an evergreen tree, because everything was dying. The leaves were falling, the plants were dying, but these trees, the evergreen trees, still had life. They were still green. So they imagined, therefore, that the evergreen tree was symbolically connected to the God of life, or it had within itself a God that kept it alive. So they would chop it down and they would place it in their homes and they would decorate it. And underneath this idol, they would place presents underneath the tree. What is now known as the Christmas pudding, that orb, I don't know if you have that sort of half orb, the Christmas pudding, and maybe the Muslims here don't know about it, and they pour over it brandy, and then they light it, and it comes ablaze. These are all connected with the pagan rituals that are supposed to return or bring back the dying sun. So the sun is dying. The sun is dying. And on the 25th of December, so the winter solstice is on the 22nd, but on the 25th, what happens? The sun is reborn. The days begin to get longer. The sun is reborn. And once again, the sun returns to life. So at this time, there is great celebration, great festivity, great enjoyment, because the Savior is born. Now, whether it was Artis, Mithra, Osiris, Baal, Dionysus, or Jesus, it's the same mythology, the same concept, paganism. How Jesus came to be mixed up in all of this, we'll see, inshallah, God willing. Now we find the story goes on, because at Easter time is the time of full rebirth, the time of resurrection. Again, in the Western Hemisphere, what happens is things start coming back to life. The leaves start appearing on the trees. The birds start laying their eggs. The little bunny rabbits start appearing again. Okay, thus the Easter bunny, thus the Easter eggs. It is all connected to paganism. And very often we find, again, in these mystery religions, these pagan religions, this God, whether it's Mithra or Osiris or Artis or Dionysus or Hercules, often they are nailed to a tree, or they are bled. And their blood and their sacrifice, which they sacrifice themselves at this time of Easter, gives life again. And through that, the people are delivered, life returns, sins are forgiven, and life is renewed. This is pagan mythology. Now, they discovered in about 1903, German excavators, they discovered the story of the passion of the Babylonian Baal. Baal actually is mentioned quite a bit in the Bible. Baal is one of the gods that the children of Israel, the Beni Israel, again and again they seem to keep going to the worship of this Baal. That's why the God keeps sending prophets. Because unfortunately, very often, some of these people start going astray. They leave the pure monotheism. They leave the pure and true religion that God revealed to Moses, and they go astray. That's one of the reasons God sends prophets. And Baal is one of these false gods that they feel tempted to worship. Now, they found the passion of Baal on some clay tablets. Of course, by the way, it's also very important to point out that these religions and these gods existed at the time of Jesus and thousands of years before the time of Jesus. They're not imitations of the Christian story. In fact, as we will clearly see, it's the other way round. The so-called passion of Christ is nothing except a pure imitation of the paganism of these gods and these people that they went through. It's exactly verbatim a copy of it, we will find. So we take the passion of Baal. The mystery of Baal was enacted every year in the spring. In places, the Baal text incidents are so close to the gospel sequence that one might even wonder if they formed a written source. They include the details of Baal's capture and his trial in the house on the mount, his torture and being led away to death together with a malefactor. Another, also charged as a malefactor, was set free. The city broke out in tumult and fighting. Baal's clothes were carried away. A woman wiped away the blood from the drawn out weapon thrust into his heart. A goddess sought to tend him, and a weeping woman came to lament at the gate of burial. He was brought back to life at the spring equinox. Of course, the early church tried to claim these similarities is that the devil had deceived people concerning the passion of Jesus, and then the devil had made the whole passion of Jesus similar, and they had made a similar thing for their gods. However, there is a much more convincing explanation. And the more convincing explanation requires us to go back a little bit again to look at some interesting historical points. Now, in my lecture in Sydney, I tried to look at the truth about Jesus from two particular angles. I tried to look at it from the angle of examining whether the biblical text could really act as an authentic source of information about the life of Jesus. And we showed that there are several problems with that. We showed in that lecture that there are several problems with it. The contradictions within the biblical text, also the presence of large numbers of other stories of the life of Jesus that did not agree with the one that is present in the Bible. And that we also showed that the present day biblical text is something that was chosen by one particular sect and one particular group and one particular mentality within Christianity. And these texts were chosen because it agreed with their idea. In fact, the gospel writers themselves confess that why did we choose these events? Why do we choose these things? As Luke, for example, confesses to Theophilus that many people have written accounts and many people have said different things. But I chose these things because it seemed good to me. And the reason why is because it testified to their concept that Jesus was the Son of God, and that the whole concept of Christ crucified being the essential gospel, Pauline Christianity essentially. However, what we find is something very more interesting, which I didn't discuss in the former lecture, and this is something, one letter Q. Now, anyone who has studied a little bit about biblical scholarship will know and understand what Q is. Q actually is short for the German word Quell, and the German word Quell means source. A very interesting thing happened when some biblical scholars, Protestant biblical scholars, started examining the Gospels. They found that Matthew and Luke contained a lot of parallel information. In fact, a large number of sayings were almost identical and similar. Yet this information was not in Mark. Although they generally agree that Mark, in fact, is the oldest of the Gospels. So they tried to think, from where did Matthew and Luke get this information? Where were they getting this information? And they realized that Matthew and Luke must have had a common source. They must have had a common source, some bit of information, some tradition, some writings that they were both referring to. And the very interesting thing is that all the similarities between Matthew and Luke are all sayings of Jesus. This is important. It's important because there were no events described. There were no things about what Jesus did and where he went. Particularly in this common source document, there is nothing in the common source document about the crucifixion, the passion. And that, for a minute, for quite a while in biblical scholarship, it didn't mean anything. They didn't really think about it until they discovered a gospel according to Thomas. They discovered the Gospel of Thomas. That was a gospel that was used and has been used by the Egyptian Coptic Church for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And this Gospel of Thomas was also a gospel that is what they call a sayings gospel. In other words, all it contained were sayings. Jesus said this and Jesus said that. And he said this and he said that. Nothing about what he did. It's all about just what he said. Now that had absolutely mind-boggling and devastating implications. Because what it meant is there is a whole tradition in early Christianity to whom the death and crucifixion of Jesus meant nothing. It was not even considered to be important. What was important for them is what Jesus said and what Jesus taught. And he didn't say and didn't teach anything about the passion. He didn't say and teach anything about the crucifixion. He taught what I was talking about before. Haqiq Allah, Haqiq al-Ibad, the rights of God, the rights of the creation. How we should worship God, how we should treat one another. It was a sayings gospel. Now that, of course, calls into question the whole presumption that Christianity from day one was this religion that believed in a Christ crucified who had come to save humanity through his death. Rather, it seems clear that early Christians considered what Christ said and what he taught about how to live really important. Whether he died and was crucified or not was almost totally irrelevant. And that means that the whole idea of God becoming a man, the whole idea of a sacrifice for the sins of humanity, the whole idea of the resurrection is unnecessary.